Thank you all for coming. What a wonderfully impressive crowd. I'd like each of you, first of all, to ask yourself honestly the question why you came. Did you come to find out who's going to win? I hope not. Did you come to find out which arguments would win? That's a little better. Did you come to find out whether God would win, as if he's waiting in the wings with bated breath to find out whether he exists or not? I hope you came for the same reason that I came and the same reason my esteemed opponent came, namely to follow the argument to wherever it goes, out of respect for truth. If you're an agnostic, you wonder whether God exists. This might help you to decide. If you're a believer, you wonder how much reason can prove of what you believe. You might find out. If you're an atheist, you might find how much reason can prove for what you believe, because atheism is a faith too, even though it doesn't have a divine object. And I don't think it's any more provable than theism. Somebody is very seriously wrong. If there is no God, then between 95 and 98% of all human beings who have ever lived in the world have been seriously deluded. They've been like Jimmy Stewart in that old movie Harvey, who believes in this invisible rabbit as the most important person in his life. Nobody can see him but Jimmy Stewart. He's not there. He's nuts. In every other way, he's normal. But if there's no God, then Freud is right. A big Santa Claus. In which case, humanity is pretty stupid. If, on the other hand, there is some sort of God and atheists are wrong, then it's the minority of atheists who are as out of touch with reality as you would be if you were a college student and came home for Christmas and your parents greeted you at the door and you pretended that they didn't exist and they gave you food and you didn't thank them for it and they gave you presents and you didn't even talk to them and you lived as if you were the only person in the world. So somebody is very seriously wrong. Whether God exists or not makes an enormous difference, because believers trust him with the meaning of their life and the destiny of their life, with everything. And if he doesn't exist, we're pouring an investment into a big black hole. Two preliminary questions. I don't claim to prove the existence of the God of the Bible or everything the Bible reveals about God. If the Bible is a divine revelation, it's telling us stuff we couldn't find out by ourselves about God. Otherwise, it would be rather superfluous. I don't think that nothing about God is provable, but I don't think that everything about God is provable. I think that just some things about God are provable. And I'm not going to start with the definition of God and then prove that that being exists. That's how Anselm does it. I don't think that works. I think you have to have the meaning of God emerge from the data of each argument. The other preliminary point is that there are really 5 questions that we have to logically distinguish. First of all, whether a thing exists. It can exist without you knowing it. Secondly, whether you know it. You can know it without being certain of it. Thirdly, whether you can have certain knowledge of it. You can be certain without a proof of that certainty. Fourth, can you prove it? You can prove it without it being a scientific proof. Finally, is there a scientific proof, a proof by the scientific method? I think the first 4 of these questions can be answered yes. I think there are certain philosophical proofs for the existence of a being that has to be called God, even though they're not scientific proofs. In fact, I will summarize 12 arguments, maybe one a minute. 5 very traditional cosmological arguments, the famous 5 ways of Aquinas, and then 4 psychological arguments, and then 3 practical arguments. Aquinas' first argument is the argument from motion, or change, to an unmoved mover, or an unchanged changer. He defines motion, or change, as the actualization of a potentiality. And he says nothing can change itself, because something that doesn't have some actual quality can't give that quality to something else that doesn't have it. For instance, this bottle of water can't get me wet unless it is already wet. And fire can't burn me unless it has kinetic energy to give. So if motion is a kind of active force, nothing moves itself. it has to be moved by another. But there is a chain of movers, moved movers. Is there a first unmoved mover? If not, how can you explain the existence of the chain? It's like who pushed down the first domino. That's a rather simple and intuitive proof. The second one is about the cause of existence. When you cause something to exist, you bring it into being for the first time. You don't just change it. Now, nothing can cause itself to exist because nothing can exist before it exists. But the cause has to exist before it can communicate existence to the effect. Now, we all exist. If existence passed down the chain of causes through parents and ancestors and through evolution and through everything from the Big Bang on, if that doesn't have a first cause, if the Big Bang has no Big Banger, then why do we get the gift of existence? Suppose there was some book that you wanted very much that could make all of philosophy totally clear, and I guaranteed you that you would get A's in all your courses if you had this book. You would say, give me the book. I would say, well, yes, but I have to borrow it first from my wife. Well, does she have it? No, she has to borrow it from her neighbor. Does she have it? No, she has to borrow it from the library. Well, does the library have it? No, they have to get it from interlibrary loan. From where? From a university? Do they have it? No. Actually, nobody has it. Oh, well, then you'll never get it. Well, existence is like that book. You get it. So since you get it, somebody must have it by nature, not just having to borrow it by being brought into existence. Which brings us to a third argument, the argument from contingency and necessity. Things are contingent. They don't have to exist. Every one of us is a great might not have been. If you're contingent on something. But if that something is itself contingent, then all the beings in the universe, which are great might not have beens, are like links in a chain which are held up somehow. And this link is held up by that link, and that link is held up by another link. Well, what holds up the whole chain? Does it just hang there in the air? If there are a sufficient number of links, does it make sense that the chain can hang itself? No. Something must ground it. Something must explain the whole chain. Thus, there must be a non-contingent being, a being that exists eternally by necessity of its own nature, rather than contingently by receiving existence as a gift from something that causes it. A fourth argument is the argument from the degrees of perfection. We observe commonsensically, and we judge that one thing is more perfect than another in various ways. We make value judgments. Unless you are a subjectivist, you believe that those value judgments can be true. So one thing really is more perfect than another. But whenever you grade things by a standard, if that grading is true, the standard must be true. Therefore, there must be an absolute standard, and that standard must be absolute perfection. But if that's only a fiction, something that you created, then it's merely subjective, and there are no grounds for your value judgments. Therefore, there must be a really most perfect being, which is one of the definitions of God. A fifth argument is the argument from design, which unfortunately is, I think, argued about in a non-useful way by both sides of the intelligent design movement, as if religion is on one side and philosophy and science is on the other side. I want to argue it neither from a religious nor a scientific point of view, but simply a philosophical point of view. We see in the universe that things cooperate together to produce a good effect. We see that the universe is a system of interlocking causes. And we see that it doesn't happen simply by random chance. The universe is much more complicated than a book. You don't explain a book by an explosion in a print factory. So if there's design, there must be a mind. Design presupposes some sort of a designer. After our first moon rocket took off from Cape Kennedy in Florida, there were two scientists who were working on the project together. One was an atheist, the other was a theist. And the theist jokingly said, "Isn't it wonderful that our rocket will hit the moon simply by chance?" The atheist said, "What nonsense." And the theist said, "Well, yes, it is, isn't it? Well, we can design a rocket. Can we design a universe? How come the universe works?" Later they were walking down the street and the atheist saw a picture in a store and said, "What a beautiful picture, I wonder who painted it." The theist said, "Nobody, it just happened by chance." There are very sophisticated refinements to the notion of design and to the notion of chance or randomness, which make this argument much more complex than it seems. But it's probably the single most popular argument for the existence of God among so-called uneducated people. Almost all primitive people use some version of it. All these arguments are taken from objective data. Let's look at subjective data. Let's look at psychological data. Inner data, you might say. Augustine has an epistemological argument from the eternity of truth to the eternity of a mind. True ideas exist in minds. If some ideas are eternally true, must there not be an eternal mind for those ideas to reside in? You can see this argument more clearly, I think, if you look at the flip side of it in Jean-Paul Sartre, who argues that precisely because there is no God and therefore no eternal mind, there are no eternal truths. Obviously, there are some eternal truths, like 2 and 2 are 4, as distinct from temporal truths, such as we are here tonight. A second psychological argument is the moral argument. There are 2 versions of this. One is from the existence of an objective moral law, or a law of human nature, or a natural law, to a lawgiver as the only adequate explanation of that law. And the second does not presuppose the existence of an objective and universal natural moral law, which was not doubted by very many thinkers in the past, but is quite doubted today. Cardinal Newman's version of the argument, which begins with the premise simply that there is one thing that even the moral relativist thinks is always wrong: to deliberately disobey your conscience. So there's at least one moral absolute. But what authority is behind that absolute? Why should conscience always be obeyed as if it is a prophet of Almighty God? If conscience is simply an evolutionary survival mechanism, if it's simply inherited animal instincts, if it's simply conformity to social forces that we unconsciously internalize by the unconscious mind, by the superego, if it's simply the voice of our parents resounding in our heads, why bow down to that as if it's infallible? And yet everyone says that it is always wrong to disobey your conscience. So if there's no divine voice behind conscience, why take it seriously? This can be a dangerous argument because it can lead in the opposite direction. It could lead someone to the conclusion, I shouldn't take my conscience seriously since there is no God. There's a third argument, which is hardly an argument at all. It's kind of a direct perception. But I noticed that very many people respond to this. In fact, I know personally 3 ex-atheists who were converted by this argument. The argument goes as follows. There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, therefore there must be a God. You either see that or you don't. A fourth psychological argument, a very interesting one, is associated with C.S. Lewis. It's the argument from desire. We can classify our desires into 2 categories. Some of them are artificial and conditioned by advertising or what books we've read, and these are not universal. They're not cross-cultural. They don't come from human nature. They come from outside forces. Other desires are universal because they come from human nature itself, like hunger or thirst or sexual desire or curiosity or the desire for beauty. We have an innate aversion to ignorance and ugliness and hunger, but we have an innate desire for knowledge and friendship and beauty, certain things that fit our human nature. We observe that every one of these natural desires or innate desires corresponds to an objective reality. Where there is a hunger, there is a food. You might not get the food, you might starve, but it would be very strange if hunger occurred in a species that didn't have stomachs, or if sexual desire occurred in a species without sex.